The first thing I noticed was not the champagne. It was the sound. Low, dragging, broken. The kind of sound a body makes when it is hurt too long and no longer has the strength to ask properly. An hour earlier, I had been in a black rideshare leaving Charlotte Douglas with my conference badge still clipped to my blazer and my carry-on wedged between my knees. I was tired in the satisfying way, the kind that comes after 5 days of pressure and one clean win. That morning in Chicago, I had closed a $4.2 million deal that 2 men twice as loud as me had assumed I would fumble before lunch. I had not. I'd bought a small candle at O'Hare on my way back, the vanilla kind Leanie liked, and tucked it carefully into my bag beside my charger and notebook. My name is Diana Calder, and I have spent most of my life learning how to walk into a room, to read it fast and never waste movement. On the ride home, I called my husband. Broderick was still at the Outer Banks for a fishing trip he had stretched into one more day. He didn't answer. I left him a voicemail anyway, light and easy. Told him I landed, told him the deal was done, told him I'd see him tomorrow and that he owed me a proper dinner for listening to me complain through 3 states and 2 airports. I was happy when I hung up. Not pretending. Happy. That feeling lasted until I opened my front door. The house was wrong in small ways first. Dishes in the sink visible from the hall, my good throw blanket on the living room floor, a half-empty bottle of my wine on the counter, left open like somebody had paid for it with carelessness instead of money. In the living room, Jalen was stretched halfway into my sofa with his phone in his hand. His mother, Cora, sat beside him with a champagne flute balanced between 2 fingers, like she was at a reception instead of in my house. He glanced up. "Hey." Cora looked at me the way people look at delivery workers. "Oh, you're back." No one asked about my trip. No one stood up. Then I saw the blanket move. Not a shift from air, not a draft. A pull. Small. Human. I walked around the couch and found Lene on the hardwood floor, curled tight on her side, knees drawn up, one arm trapped under her body. Her face was the wrong color. Sweat had soaked the hair around her temples and neck. Her breathing came in thin little catches, and every few seconds that sound came out of her again, low and torn, like pain had worn her down past language. On the coffee table sat a glass of water placed just far enough away to be useless. Her phone was nowhere near her. I looked at Jalen, then at Cora. Neither one moved toward her. Neither one looked ashamed enough for what I was seeing. I did not speak right away. I bent slightly, just enough to see Lena's face better, and her eyelids fluttered without fully opening. She had been there long enough for her body to stop expecting rescue. Right in the middle of that room, with my suitcase still upright by the door and my work badge brushing against my blouse, I understood something cold and complete. Whatever story had been happening in this house before I stepped into it had ended the second I got home. About halfway through this, let me ask you something simple. What time are you watching this from where you are? Then I set my bag down slowly. The badge on my blazer caught the light when I straightened. I looked at the champagne flute in Cora's hand. Then I looked at my stepdaughter shaking on my floor. Then I reached into my blazer pocket and took out my phone. Those 12 seconds were not shock. They were inventory. I have heard people say a bad moment blurs. That has never been true for me. Bad moments sharpen. They separate themselves into pieces and wait to see what kind of woman is standing in the middle of them. I stood in my living room with my phone in my hand and let the room show me exactly what it was. Lene on the floor, folded around pain. The champagne flutes, the open bottle, Jalen still holding his phone, screen lit, thumb paused over nothing that could save anybody. The water on the coffee table, or close enough to look helpful and far enough to prove it hadn't been. Cora sitting upright now, not startled exactly, but adjusting, rewriting, preparing. I opened my camera. When I pressed record, I did not crouch first. I did not ask questions. I did not announce feelings. My voice came out level, almost soft. April 13th, 4:49 p.m. My name is Diana Calder. I am at my residence in Charlotte. I panned slowly. Adult female on the floor in visible distress, responsive but weak. 2 other adults present. No emergency personnel contacted prior to my arrival. Cora rose halfway from the couch. Now hold on, because that is not... I raised one finger without looking at her. That did it, and she stopped in the middle of her sentence and sat back down with a tiny stiffness in her shoulders that told me she understood exactly what had happened. The room was no longer social. It was no longer theirs. It belonged to the record now. I angled the phone toward the coffee table. Glass of water placed out of reach. No visible phone near the patient. Then to Jalen. Male present, holding active mobile device. No indication of ongoing emergency call. His face changed then. Not guilt. Not yet. Alarm. The selfish kind. The kind that arrives when a person realizes a private failure may become public fact. She said she was fine, he muttered. She said she just needed a minute. Don't. That one word came out flat enough to stop him cold. He shut his mouth. Cora looked from him to me and back again, measuring distance, tone, a possibility. She still thought this might be managed if she found the right angle. I turned the camera back to Lene and lowered myself beside her. Her skin looked slick and cold at once. I could feel the heat trapped under it, the strain in her breathing, the small tremor running through her body. I kept recording with one hand and used the other to dial. The dispatcher picked up quickly. 911, what is your emergency? My stepdaughter is in acute medical distress, I said. We are at... I gave the address cleanly. She is conscious but barely responsive, sweating, shaking, severe abdominal pain, and appears to have been in this condition for an extended period without medical assistance. I need an ambulance. The dispatcher began asking questions. Age, breathing, bleeding. How long? I answered what I knew. Then I said the word that changed the room. There may also be neglect involved. Cora inhaled sharply behind me, not loud, but sharp enough to cut through the dispatcher's voice. The dispatcher asked me to repeat it. I said there may be neglect involved, I answered. 2 adults were present with her before I arrived. No one called for help. The silence behind me shifted shape. I didn't need to see their faces to know it had landed. They heard what I had done. More importantly, they understood it. I had taken this out of the family and put it where facts lived. The dispatcher told me help was on the way and asked me to stay on the line. I set the phone so the camera still held the room and moved my hand into Lene's hair, smoothing it back from her damp forehead. Baby, listen to me, I said quietly. Oh, they're coming. Her eyes opened a sliver. Her lips moved before sound came. I leaned closer. Mom. It was barely a whisper. I told them. My throat tightened, but my voice did not. I know. I reached for the Notes app with my free hand and started typing timestamps with my thumb while the dispatcher kept speaking in my ear. I did not look at Jalen or Cora again until the sirens began. 4 minutes can become a very long place when nobody in the room is allowed to hide inside confusion. The dispatcher stayed in my ear, calm and methodical, asking me to keep Lene awake if I could, asking whether her breathing had changed, whether she could answer simple questions. I gave short answers and watched the room without appearing to. My phone was still recording from the coffee table. They angled exactly where I wanted it, wide enough to catch Lene on the floor, the sofa behind her, the bottle, the flutes, the people who had turned my living room into something rotten. Cora found her voice first. She said she needed to lie down, she said. The words coming fast now, practiced almost before they left her mouth. She kept saying it was cramping. Young women do overreact sometimes when they get themselves upset. I said nothing. She took my silence for space and kept going. We gave her water. We told her to rest. We did not want to waste emergency resources if this was just one of those episodes. One of those episodes. I looked down at Lene's face. Sweat still shone at her temples. Her mouth tightened every few seconds with the kind of pain that strips a person down to instinct. Now I laid my hand flat against the center of her back and felt the trembling there. The house around us was mine, bought in my name years before Broderick and I ever stood in front of anybody and made vows. Every wall, every floorboard, every crown-molding detail I had argued over with a contractor, every mortgage payment, every tax bill, every repair. I knew exactly what belonged in this house and what did not. At that moment, what did not belong in it was the easy comfort sitting on my sofa in a cream blouse, holding a champagne flute, while my stepdaughter shook on the hardwood. Jalen must have decided silence made him look bad because he finally moved. He crouched beside Lene and reached toward her hand with a softness that arrived too late to mean anything. But it was the gesture of a man performing concern after the audience had been seated. I lifted my eyes to him once. That was all. He stopped before he touched her, just froze there for half a beat, then pulled his hand back like he'd reached toward a hot surface he had not expected to burn. When he stood again, he tried to fold his face into something wounded and misunderstood. It did not suit him. Cora watched that happen, and for the first time since I walked through my front door, I saw uncertainty enter her. The dispatcher was still asking questions. I answered one, then another. Then I stood carefully and crossed into the kitchen. Behind me, Cora started again, a little sharper now. I do think this is being made into more than it is. I kept walking. At the sink, I filled a glass with cold water, and the ordinary sound of it, tap turning, water striking glass, landed strangely in that room. Domestic, clean, useful. I carried it back, bent down, and held it where Lene could reach if she wanted it. She could not manage more than a tiny swallow, but that was not the point. The point was that care and performance had finally been placed side by side in the same room, and nobody there could mistake one for the other. Cora understood that too. I could feel her recalculating behind me. Women like her know what to do with tears. They know what to do with shouting, blame, dramatic words, family noise. They know how to survive emotional weather because they can always claim they were caught in it too. What she did not know how to manage was a woman who had gone still on purpose. A siren rose in the distance. Jalen's head turned first, then Cora's. Both of them flinched before I did, and that told me more than anything either one had said. I was already on my feet, moving toward the front door. The house stopped being domestic the second the front door opened. There was a brief moment of interruption before control set in. The lead paramedic paused just inside the doorway, eyes sweeping the room once, fast but thorough, recalibrating from whatever call they had just left to what was in front of them now. Then they moved. 2 paramedics came in first with a stretcher behind them, fast without being frantic, eyes moving the way trained eyes move when they enter a room and know immediately that somebody has already lost too much time. A police officer stepped in right after them, then another behind him, not loud, not dramatic, just present. The uniforms have a way of changing the temperature in a room, so do people who write things down for a living. I moved aside and pointed straight to Lene. "She's here." The lead paramedic dropped to one knee beside her and began speaking in a firm, measured tone, already assessing before his hands even settled. "Hey, can you hear me? Stay with me." One of the others opened equipment with quiet efficiency. The officer nearest me asked if I was the caller. Yes. By then, I already had my notes open. During those 4 minutes while Cora talked and Jalen pretended and Lene shook on my floor, I had typed what mattered. Arrival time. What I saw. What I heard. When I started recording. When I called 911. "I've got a timeline," I added, holding the phone out, "from when I entered." He took it, but not immediately. His eyes flicked once to Lene, then back to me, weighing priority. "Give me 10 seconds, he said. He turned back to her first. That mattered. Only after the second paramedic confirmed her airway and breathing did he reach back and take my phone, scanning it quickly before looking up at me with the briefest shift in his face. Not warmth, recognition, respect for somebody who had made his work cleaner in a dirty room. "This helps," he said. "It's time-stamped," I answered. Behind him, the second paramedic was already checking Linnée's pulse, her pupils, her abdomen. When his hand pressed lightly along her side, Linnée made a broken sound, and something in my chest pulled tight enough to hurt. I stayed where I was, near enough for her to find me, far enough not to interfere. "Has she been vomiting? Any bleeding?" one of them asked without looking up. "I don't know," I said. "She was like this when I got here." "How long ago?" 4:47. I walked in and found her on the floor. One of the officers turned to Jalen. "How long has she been on the floor?" Jalen opened his mouth and did not fill it. He looked at Cora once, then back at the officer. "I'm not sure exactly. I arrived at 4:47, I said. Nobody had to ask me twice. I held up my phone. Video begins at 4:49. She was already in that condition when I entered the room. The officer took the phone from my hand and watched the opening seconds, then a few more, longer than I expected. His eyes moved once toward the coffee table, once toward Linnée, once toward the couch. He did not hand the phone back right away. Then the second officer had drifted farther into the living room, not aimless, just thorough. He paused by the table. The 2 flutes were still there, the bottle still open. Condensation still gathered low on the glass. He pulled out his own phone and photographed the setup without saying a word. Nobody asked him to. He did it because some things explain themselves better later if nobody gets the chance to tidy them first. Then he stepped slightly closer to the couch, eyes moving once more across the room, fixing positions, distances, details that would matter once the moment was no longer protected by surprise. Cora chose that moment to find her courage again. "Well, she has been uncomfortable since yesterday," she said, with that careful tone people use when they think sounding reasonable can save them. "But we didn't know it was anything serious. She said it was pain, but young women do say all kinds of things when they're upset." The officer, writing in his small notebook, looked up. "Since yesterday?" he asked. Cora nodded too quickly. "Yes, but not like this exactly. It got worse today." He wrote that down. Not slowly, not dramatically, just enough to make the sentence real. "I'm going to need both of your full names," he added, glancing between her and Jalen. "We'll be documenting this for an incident report." That was when the room shifted again. Not louder, not bigger, just heavier. I watched her realize, a half second too late, that she had offered more than sympathy. She had offered time. Time is dangerous when facts start attaching themselves to it. The paramedics began lifting Linnée carefully. "On 3, 1, 2. Her face tightened, but her eyes opened a little when they moved her. I stepped closer and her hand came out weak and searching until it found mine. I closed my fingers around hers. That was the only thing in that room that mattered. "Ma'am, you can ride with us," one of the paramedics said without looking away from his work. "I will," I answered. Behind me, one of the officers spoke again, voice even. "We'll follow up after she's transported. Someone will be in touch." He paused just long enough to add, "We're documenting everything as it stands." Not a warning, a record. I walked beside the stretcher as they carried her through my front door. The evening air hit differently outside, cooler, cleaner, like the house itself had already begun separating from what had happened inside it. Behind me were the flutes, the bottle, the notebook, the early shape of statements that would not hold. Ahead of me was my stepdaughter. I did not look back. 90 minutes under fluorescent light can make time feel rude. Hospitals do not pause for private disasters. They keep moving around them. Wheels squeak. Rubber soles pass. Someone laughs too loudly at the far end of a corridor because their own fear has finally broken and turned into relief. A machine beeps behind a curtain. An elevator opens, closes, opens again. And in the middle of all that ordinary motion, I sat in a molded chair outside room 214 with my hands folded too tightly in my lap and waited for somebody to tell me how close I had come to losing her. By then, my conference badge was still on, though I had stopped noticing it until a nurse came out and her eyes flicked to it before she asked whether I was family. I said yes. She nodded and disappeared again. I took the badge off after that and laid it across my knee. The plastic edge pressed a line into my palm. When the doctor finally came, she did not waste words. I appreciated that about her immediately. "Ruptured ovarian cyst," she said. "Internal bleeding started. We've stabilized her." Stabilized. There are words people use every day that turn holy when they hand them back to you at the right moment. I stood when she spoke, though I do not remember deciding to stand. She kept her voice level, direct, respectful. The delay increased the risk significantly. Another hour would have changed this. She did not dramatize it. She did not soften it either. She let the sentence land whole. Another hour. I thanked her. Not because gratitude was large enough for what I felt, but because it was the only orderly thing I had to offer. She told me Lainey was resting and that I could see her soon. Then she moved on to the next door, the next family, the next room where somebody else's life had tilted. I sat back down for a moment and looked at the floor. The crack in me did not happen loudly, no shaking, no collapse. Just one long exhale that left my body like it had been waiting for permission since I walked into my house and found her on that floor. I pressed my fingers against my mouth and held still until the feeling passed enough for me to stand again. When I entered room 214, the lights were dimmer than the hallway. Lene looked smaller in the bed than she ever had in my mind, and the sweat had been cleaned from her face. Her breathing was steadier now, her skin less frightening to look at. There was an IV in her arm, a monitor at her side, and a thin hospital blanket pulled up to her waist. I sat in the chair beside her and took her hand carefully. She did not wake up. That almost made it easier because sleep meant there was nothing she needed from me in that exact moment except presence. I could give that. I could sit. I could stay. I could make sure when she opened her eyes again, she would not wake into uncertainty. I called Broderick once more, straight to voicemail. I looked at the screen for a second after the tone, then left him facts and nothing else. Lene was at the hospital. She'd been treated. She was stable. I needed him to call me back as soon as he got service. My voice sounded so even it might have belonged to another woman. A few minutes later, my phone lit again. "Cheryl from work. You did it. $4.2 million. Drinks when you're back in office. Proud of you." I read the message once and set the phone face down on my thigh. That deal had mattered to me 6 hours earlier. It had taken months of work, 3 bad drafts, 2 near collapses, and 1 flight I nearly missed. Now it felt like something I had watched happen to a woman sitting in another airport, another life, another city where no one had left a girl on the floor and called it patience. At 9:14 p.m., I picked the phone up again and called Sandra Okafor. She answered on the second ring. "Hey," she said, warm at first. "You home?" "Yes," I said, "and I need you to be my attorney tomorrow, not my friend." There was no pause on her end after that. "Tell me everything." The video was not emotional evidence. It was leverage with a spine. By 8 the next morning, I was in Sandra Okafor's office wearing the same blazer, a clean blouse, and the kind of fatigue that settles behind the eyes instead of on the face. I had slept 3 hours in a hospital chair, gone home only long enough to shower, then driven uptown with my phone in my bag and my mind already arranging facts into order. Sandra had known me for 11 years. She knew the difference between me needing comfort and me needing strategy. That morning, I needed strategy. She shut her office door, took my phone, and said, "Start at the beginning." I did, not dramatically, not slowly. I gave her the airport return, the condition of the house, the floor, the flutes, or the recording, the call, the hospital, the doctor's statement. Then I stopped talking and let the material speak. Sandra watched the video once without interruption, then again. The second time, she paused in two places. First on the shot of the coffee table, where the water sat uselessly out of Lanai's reach, then on Jalen's phone, still in his hand, while mine was already calling for help. After that, she pulled up the 911 transcript I had requested through the patient relations desk that morning, read the officer's notes from the responding scene, and skimmed the hospital report confirming the rupture, the bleeding, the delay. When she finished, she folded her hands once over the legal pad on her desk. "Criminally," she said, "this is uncertain. Neglect is a high bar outside a formal caregiving relationship. And prosecutors are cautious when they think defense counsel can muddy motive with confusion." I nodded. That part I understood. "Civilly," she continued, "this is much stronger. Liability exposure is significant. The video matters because it fixes the room before anybody had time to rearrange themselves. The timeline matters because it shows response versus non-response. The hospital report matters because it gives consequence to the delay." She slid the phone back toward me, but kept one fingertip resting on it for a beat. "This," she said, tapping the screen lightly, "is structural leverage." I looked down at my own reflection in the dark glass for half a second, then back at her. "There's more," I said. That got her attention in a different way. And I told her what Lanae had mentioned months earlier and brushed past at the time, because I had wanted to respect the boundaries of a marriage I did not fully trust. Pressure about money, talk of temporary help, a conversation about a loan that did not sound right when I heard it and sounded worse now. Sandra's expression changed by degrees, not dramatically, just enough for me to know her mind had moved to another shelf entirely. What exactly did she say? That he needed her to co-sign something, that it was digital, that he told her it would bridge a short gap and then be cleared. She was sick around that time too, tired, not thinking clearly. He framed it as support. Sandra reached for her pen. Then did she ever mention where the money went? Not directly. Did she say whether she saw the account herself? I don't know. Sandra wrote a few neat lines, then looked up. If he used her identity while she was isolated and unwell, and the funds landed in an account he controlled, that changes the shape of this. A lot. There it was. The second doorway opening. She asked for dates, half memories, stray details, anything Lanae might have said without realizing it mattered. I gave her everything I had. Not much, but enough to start a trail. When the meeting ended, Sandra walked me to the door. Her hand rested on the frame while she studied me in that quiet way lawyers do when they're already calculating 5 moves ahead. "You documented before reacting," she said. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder. "That's what I do." Without them in the room, the truth stopped limping. Lanae was sitting up when I came back from speaking to the nurse, the hospital tray pushed untouched to one side, her hair tied loosely at the nape of her neck with the elastic I had found in my purse. The room was quiet except for the monitor beside her bed and the soft hiss of air from somewhere above us. Morning had shifted into that flat hospital afternoon where time feels both heavy and thin. No Jalen, no Cora, no voices smoothing over harm and calling it misunderstanding. Just the two of us and a door that stayed closed. I took the chair beside her bed and waited. That mattered. Waiting. People tell the truth faster when they don't feel hunted for it. At first, when it came in pieces so small they might have sounded ordinary to anybody listening from outside the room. He would joke about her being sensitive. He would tell her she always made things bigger than they were. If she said she was tired, he said she worried too much. If she said something hurt, he asked whether she had considered that stress could make a person dramatic. Cora was worse in quieter ways, smiles that did not warm, advice that landed like correction, little comments that could pass for concern if repeated in the right tone. She kept saying I needed to settle into marriage, Lene said, staring at the blanket over her lap, that some women come into a home thinking everything should shift around them. My hands stayed folded. In my house. A tiny, tired breath left her, not quite a laugh. But she never called it yours, she said. Not when you were gone. That sat between us for a second. Then she kept going. The isolation had not looked dramatic from the outside either. That was part of why it worked. Jalen did not forbid her from seeing people. He just made every visit feel inconvenient. Every call became bad timing. Every plan turned into a reason he needed something else first. Cora helped by making Lene feel watched in her own kitchen, corrected in her own tone. Too clumsy, too emotional, too lucky to complain. By the time Lene noticed how quiet her life had become, she was already spending most days explaining herself to people who had no right to require it. They made everything small, she said after a moment, so I started making myself small to match it. That line settled deeper than the rest. Now the money came next. He said it was what married people do, she said. He kept using that phrase. Her fingers tightened under mine when I reached for her hand. He said he just needed help getting through something temporary. He had the forms on his laptop. He said we were building together. I thought of Sandra's face the day before, of the notes she had started taking without looking up. I didn't read enough, Lene said. I was tired all the time then. There was a pause after that, the kind that announces a deeper cut. The monitor ticked softly beside her. When she spoke again, her voice changed. I was pregnant. For a second, the room tilted, not outward, inward. Something in my chest dropped hard and fast. Like a step I had expected to be there wasn't. I felt it in my hands first, a brief loss of strength. A flicker I had to steady before it showed. My mouth opened before I decided what it would say, then closed again. I did not speak. I made myself breathe once, slow, controlled, the way you do when something inside you has just broken and you refuse to let it make noise. Then I looked back at her. It was early, she said quickly, like she was trying to make the loss easier to hold by making it smaller. I found out, and then a few weeks later, I started bleeding. I told Jalen. I told Cora. She said sometimes stress does that and that I should lie down before I embarrassed myself at urgent care over nothing. My jaw tightened before I could stop it. I let it, just for a second. Then I smoothed it out. I kept my face steady because she needed steadiness more than she needed my horror. Did anyone take you to a doctor? She shook her head. I never really dealt with it, she said. Afterward, everybody acted like the cleanest thing was not to make it real. For a moment, all I could hear was the monitor. Then Lene looked at me fully, and that was worse because there was no defensiveness in her face, just a kind of exhausted honesty. I kept thinking you'd notice. The sentence entered me whole, not sharp, not loud, heavy. I let it sit there between us without trying to move it somewhere easier. I nodded once. I should have. She shook her head immediately, eyes filling. No, I didn't want you to. I wanted to handle my own marriage. I wanted to be okay on my own. Her voice thinned, but it didn't break. I thought if I just tried harder, it would feel normal again. There it was. Not confusion. Training. I wasn't okay. I tightened my hold on her hand, just enough for her to feel it, not enough to interrupt what she was giving me. You're not crazy, I said quietly. None of that was normal. Her eyes closed briefly, and something in her shoulders dropped, like a weight she had been holding without knowing it had finally been named. I stayed with her until her breathing evened out and her eyes finally closed. I smoothed the blanket once, pressed my lips to her forehead, and stood before the feeling in my chest could turn into something she would have to carry with me. I made it to the stairwell at the end of the corridor before I stopped. The door closed behind me with a soft, final click. I leaned one hand against the concrete wall and brought the other up to my mouth, pressing hard enough to keep the sound in. No audience. No witness. Just one controlled breath that broke anyway, and the full weight of everything she had been carrying, alone finally finding somewhere to land. The house was no longer shared by the time Broderick came through the front door. I was at the kitchen table with a legal pad, a cup of coffee gone cold, and the kind of stillness that settles in after a decision has already been made. Morning light came through the back windows in clean stripes across the floor. My phone sat face up beside Sandra's last text. The attorney-approved notice had gone out hours earlier. You have 24 hours to vacate the property. Short, direct, backed by ownership records in my name, the documented emergency, and the simple legal reality that neither of them had tenancy, lease, or any legal claim to remain in that house once permission was withdrawn, especially not after what had happened on that floor. Sandra had been clear about that. Guest status ends the moment safety is compromised. I had standing. I was using it. Broderick stepped in, carrying a duffel and a smell of salt water and motor oil, the trip still clinging to him. He'd been out past signal range most of the previous day, somewhere between coastline and open water, unreachable in the kind of way that only feels innocent until something goes wrong on land. He shut the door quietly behind him. One look at my face was enough to take the road off him. What happened? I did not answer immediately. I stood, crossed the kitchen, and put my arms around him once, briefly. That was all I had in me. Then I pulled back and said, "Sit down." He did. But I told him everything in order, not the emotional version, the factual one. My flight home, the living room, the recording, the ambulance, the officers, the doctor, the timeline, Sandra, the notice. I gave it to him clean because clean was what I trusted. He did not interrupt once. Not when I mentioned Lene on the floor, not when I told him what the doctor said, not even when I repeated the word neglect. When I finished, he held my gaze for a moment and said, "Show me." I handed him the phone. He watched the video standing at the kitchen counter, one hand braced against the edge of it, the other holding the phone lower and lower as it played. He did not speak during the clip. He did not move much either, but I watched the muscles in his jaw change as the room on that screen revealed itself piece by piece. Lene on the hardwood. On the flutes, Jalen's phone, Cora's voice trying to smooth over something ugly. When it ended, he looked at the black screen for a second longer, then set the phone down carefully. "What do you need me to do?" Not a speech, not outrage for performance, a decision. I slid the notepad toward him. The locks are being changed at noon. Sandra arranged for a civil standby during pickup. Their things are boxed in the guest room and hall. I want every handoff documented. He nodded once. Done. And that was how the day moved. Not dramatically, correctly. The locksmith arrived just before noon. I walked him through every entry point myself. Front door, back door, side access. No assumptions, no shortcuts. Broderick stayed by the door while the deadbolt, handle set, and back locks were replaced one by one. Metal turned, screws tightened. Old access removed with quiet finality. The locksmith handed over the new keys. I kept them. Broderick signed the receipt, stapled it to the property file I had started, and wrote the time in the margin. 12:18 p.m. documented. At 1:30, Jalen arrived with a patrol car parked at the curb and all the false humility he could gather on short notice. Cora was not with him. That told me something. Either she knew better than to face me again that soon, or she knew she would make it worse. The officer remained at the curb until Broderick stepped out to meet them, making it clear without saying it that this was not a conversation. It was a supervised exchange. I did not go outside. Broderick handled the exchange from the porch with the officer present and a clipboard in hand. I watched through the window without stepping into it. Box by box, garment bag, laptop, shoes, toiletries. A framed photo I had not realized was missing from the guest room, each item listed, each transfer noted, each signature placed where it would matter later. At one point, Jalen paused like he might say something. I saw his shoulders shift, his mouth open slightly. Broderick didn't give him the space. "Is everything accounted for?" he asked, voice level. That was the only conversation that happened. No arguments, no explanations, no casual wandering back into my house, no second chances disguised as forgotten belongings. By 3, they were gone. The officer left last. Before he stepped off the porch, he turned slightly toward Broderick and said, "If anything further comes up, it'll go through report follow-up." Then, after a brief pause, "Given the medical call yesterday, we're noting this as a precautionary separation." Not a warning, a record continuing itself. The quiet that settled afterward did not feel empty. It felt disinfected. When Lene was discharged later that day, Broderick and I brought her home together. She moved slowly through the front door in socks and borrowed sweatpants, one hand still weak from the IV tape that had just been removed. Her eyes drifted to the wall hook where Jalen's keys used to hang, then to the chair where he liked to drop his jacket, then to the space itself. Nothing there. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a long second, breathing like someone testing air after smoke, not trusting it yet, just checking. Broderick went straight to the kettle and filled it without asking, and the sound of water hitting metal filled the room with something steady, ordinary, safe. I stayed near her, not touching yet, letting her feel the room without interruption. After a moment, she let out a slow breath. "It's quiet," she said. "Yeah," I answered. She nodded once, almost to herself. Good quiet. That was the first real thing she had claimed since the hospital. When she finally looked at me, the confusion was gone. What replaced it was smaller, quieter, safer. They went public before they went quiet. That told me 2 things immediately. First, Cora was still trying to control the story with speed. Second, Jalen was weak enough to let her. People who know they are standing on truth do not usually rush to the internet before they speak to a lawyer. They do not post vague wounds and borrowed dignity. They do not start building witnesses out of strangers. I found out just after dinner. Lene was upstairs resting. Broderick was in the den finishing an email on his laptop. I was in the kitchen rinsing out a teacup when my phone buzzed with a message from my neighbor across the street. "You may want to see this." There was a screenshot attached. Jalen had posted a black background with white lettering, the kind of thing people use when they want to sound injured and important at the same time. Some people wait for a hard moment so they can become who they really are. Prayers appreciated. False narratives destroy families. Below it, one of his cousins had commented something about controlling women and never trusting people who need to run everything. Cora had not posted directly, but she had already begun doing what women like her do best, circulating language without attaching her own face to it. By the time I clicked over, I could already see the shape of the story they were trying to build. I had always hated him. I had overreacted. Lene had not really been that sick. I had used a private health scare to push a young husband out of his marriage. None of it surprised me. What interested me was the mistake. He had replied to someone underneath the post, something quickly deleted, but not before my neighbor caught it in the screenshot. She came in acting crazy before anybody even knew what was going on. I read that line twice, before anybody knew. The problem with panic lies is that they rarely respect time. Jalen had already told police and medical staff, by way of silence in Cora's mouth, or that Lene had been in pain since the day before. Cora had admitted that much herself. The room was documented. The timestamps were documented. The call was documented. And now here he was, publicly suggesting confusion in a way that contradicted the known sequence of events. I dried my hands, walked into the den, and handed the phone to Broderick. He read the post, then the comments, then the deleted line preserved in the screenshot. "That's careless," he said. "It is," I answered. I forwarded everything to Sandra without commentary. She replied 3 minutes later, "Received. Do not engage." I had no intention of engaging. The urge to defend yourself online is often less about truth than pride. I was not interested in pride. I was interested in pattern, record, sequence. Let them be sloppy in public, or let them confuse sympathy with evidence. Every extra word from them was another chance to step on their own version of events. The only response that went out from this house did not come from me. At 8:21, Broderick's phone rang. Jalen. Broderick looked at the screen, then at me. I nodded once. He answered on speaker but held the phone low between us on the kitchen island. Jalen started with injured confusion, then edged toward accusation. He said people were talking. He said we were making this uglier than it had to be. He said Cora was devastated by how she'd been treated. Broderick let him finish. Then he said, in the same calm tone he used with service contractors and bank managers, "Everything is documented." That was all. Not a threat, not an argument, just a fact placed where it could do its work. And there was a pause on the line after that. Not long, but long enough for me to hear Jalen understand that he was no longer speaking into a family dispute. He ended the call without saying goodbye. Nothing else came in that night. By 9, the house was quiet again. I checked on Lene once, found her asleep on her side with one hand tucked under her cheek, and pulled her blanket up a little higher. Then I went back to my room, turned off my lamp, and lay down beside the man who had said exactly what needed saying and nothing more. For the first time since Chicago, I slept all the way through the night. The numbers told the truth faster than people ever did. Sandra had warned me about that in her office 2 days earlier, and by the time I sat across from her again that Thursday afternoon, I understood exactly what she meant. People could cry. People could explain. People could post black screens with white text and call themselves misunderstood. But numbers had no vanity. They did not need sympathy. They only needed a trail. Sandra turned her monitor slightly so I could see it. "Start here," she said. The account summary looked ordinary at first glance, which I suspected was the point. Small transfers, mid-range withdrawals, payments folded into the kind of digital clutter most people never study until something has already gone wrong. But once she opened the tracing document beside it, the pattern sharpened. One loan, $31,000. Authorized digitally during the same stretch of time when Lene had been exhausted, unwell, and from everything she had now told me, increasingly dependent on Jalen to frame reality for her. "Yeah, and he presented it as temporary help," Sandra said. "That part matters because it goes to coercion and misrepresentation." I kept my eyes on the screen. The authorization trail tied back to a device registered under Jalen's name. Same device history, same login behavior, same sequence of access points over a period that was suddenly much less abstract once it sat in front of me in neat rows and timestamps. The money had not scattered randomly after that. It moved with purpose. Into an account he controlled, out again in portions, lease payments, cash withdrawals, and then the line that made me sit back a fraction in my chair. A transfer connected to a property deposit. Sandra clicked into the supporting file. Concord. Small investment property. Purchased quietly. Only his name attached. A partial down payment traced directly to money that had come through Lene's credit and into his hands. I stared at the address, then at the amount, then back at the account movement. He bought property with it. "Yes," Sandra said. "At least in part." The room felt very still after that, not because I was shocked anymore, Shock had already had its turn in my life, and it had used itself up on a hardwood floor beside a moving blanket. What I felt now was narrower, colder, a kind of respect for the full shape of what had been done. This had not been a husband making bad choices under pressure. This had been a system. Persuasion dressed up as partnership. Access turned into entitlement. Illness turned into opportunity. I thought of Lene at my kitchen table months ago, was signing something on a laptop because someone she had married told her that was what support looked like. I thought of how often women are asked to prove love by handing over clarity. I thought of how ordinary evil can look when it wears soft language and uses the shared pronoun, we. Sandra clicked once more and opened a phone screenshot Lene had forwarded that morning after Jalen reached out again. His message was long, circling, apologetic in the way weak men often confuse with remorse. Most of it was fog. Then there was the line that mattered. You know you needed me. I read it and felt my mouth flatten. There it was, no tenderness, no concern, just possession hiding inside memory. He had not helped her. He had trained her to experience dependence as gratitude. So Sandra leaned back in her chair and watched me read it a second time. Control, I said. Exactly. Not help, not strain, not marital miscommunication. Control. I looked again at the loan file, the device trail, the property deposit, the little sequence of choices that had seemed private while they were happening and now looked almost embarrassingly obvious under light. $31,000 was a real amount of money. But what sat heavier than the number itself was the intention inside it. He had not simply taken from her. He had used her illness, her trust, and her position inside my house to build something with his own name on it. Sandra held out her hand for the phone. Send me the original version of that text thread. Full chain. No screenshots if you can help it. I forwarded it immediately. She scanned the message once, then gave a short nod that contained no surprise at all. Perfect. Clarity did not arrive in Lene like courage in a movie. It came in smaller pieces than that, quieter pieces. It came when she stopped apologizing before finishing a sentence. It came when she started saying his name without flinching afterward. It came when she began looking at papers as if they belonged to her life instead of to a problem she had to survive around. Her first therapy appointment was on a Tuesday afternoon. I drove her there, though she could have driven herself. I did not offer opinions on the way over. I did not tell her what I hoped the session would do. I only asked whether she wanted the air colder and whether she had her phone charger. She answered both questions. Now and then looked out the passenger window for most of the drive. When we arrived, she sat still for one beat with her hand on the door handle, then got out and went inside without asking me to walk her in. I waited in the parking lot, not because she needed supervision, because beginning something hard deserves witness, even if the witness stays in the car and minds her own business. When she came back out 48 minutes later, there was no dramatic change in her face, no sudden peace, no cleansing tears, but something in the way she crossed the lot had shifted. Less drift, more decision. That evening, after dinner, she came into the kitchen while I was putting plates in the dishwasher. Broderick was in the den, the television low, giving us the kind of privacy good men know how to give without announcing it. Lene stood at the counter for a second and said, "I want to speak to the attorney." I dried my hands and turned to look at her fully. "Okay," I said. She nodded once. "I'm done being confused on purpose." That line stayed with me. The next afternoon, we sat in Sandra's office together. Lene on one side of the desk, me on the other. Sandra had already built the folders: medical timeline, loan records, device trail, property connection, the social media screenshots, the text thread. Sandra moved through the material with the calm of somebody laying out tools before repair. Lene answered every question directly. Dates, phrases, when the digital forms came up, what Jalen told her the money was for, what account he said it would hit, when Cora was in the room, when she was not, the sequence of her pain, the week of the pregnancy loss, the days afterward when nobody suggested a doctor, only rest and silence. Then Lene reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook. "I keep journals," she said, almost apologetically. "Not every day, just enough to remember things." Sandra took it carefully. I watched her eyes change as she skimmed the entries. Not because the notebook was poetic. It wasn't. It was practical in the way wounded people sometimes become when they are trying to understand whether what they are living is real. Dates, fragments, things he said, money mentioned, a note about feeling too tired to read a form properly, a line about Cora saying some women confuse pain with attention. Sandra closed the cover and set the journal down with unusual gentleness. "This helps," she said. By Friday, the papers were ready. The legal separation first. Financial claim included. Property issue preserved. Everything filed against a verified workplace address because Sandra had no interest in playing hide-and-seek with a man who understood delay as strategy. He was served at the real estate office just after noon. I was not there, but Lene was with Sandra when the process server called to confirm completion. And later that evening, Sandra told us exactly how it had gone. Joelyn had been standing near the front desk speaking to another agent when he was approached. He took the envelope with visible irritation, glanced at the heading, then looked up too fast, too sharp. Whatever he said next was low and immediate and not professional enough to miss. Two people in the office stopped pretending not to listen. A third turned around fully. And by the time he stepped outside with the documents in his hand, his composure was gone and everybody knew something had cracked. That night, Lene sat on the edge of her bed in my house, barefoot, tired, staring down at her own hands like they belonged to somebody new. When I passed her doorway, she looked up and said very quietly, "I thought that would feel worse." I leaned against the frame. "What does it feel like?" She let out a long breath, like I finally told the truth where it could do something. She came on a Saturday morning because women like Cora prefer their performances timed for comfort. The bell rang once while I was at the kitchen table with coffee and a stack of documents Sandra had sent over the night before. Not urgent papers, follow-up papers. The kind that meant things were moving exactly as they should. And I glanced toward the front of the house and knew before I stood that it would be her. Some people carry a rhythm with them even when they are outside your walls. A second ring followed, longer this time. Then a knock sharp enough to announce that whoever was on the other side believed she still had the right to summon attention in my house. I set my cup down and walked to the door. When I opened it, Cora was standing there in a pressed linen blouse and the face she used for church women, school meetings, and any room where she intended to sound reasonable before she sounded cruel. She held her handbag in front of her with both hands. That alone told me she had rehearsed. "I think we need to talk," she said. "No," I answered. That should have been enough. It was not enough for her. And she shifted immediately into the script she had brought with her. Family, grace, the stress young couples go through, how easy it is for medical moments to be misunderstood when emotions are already high, how Lene had always been sensitive, how I, in her words, had a tendency to turn concern into escalation. She said the word misunderstanding twice. She said the phrase, family unity, like she expected it to soften me. She spoke of the marriage as if it were a sacred object damaged by noise instead of by neglect, manipulation, and theft. I did not interrupt. That unsettled her more than anger would have. She kept talking, likely because silence from me still looked to her like uncertainty. She mistook listening for openness. That is a mistake people often make when they have spent their lives using words as pressure rather than truth. "This has gone too far," she said finally. "There are legal people involved now. There are filings. There is embarrassment where none of this needed to go. Lene has always been emotional, and Jalen has made mistakes. Yes, but mistakes inside a marriage are not crimes. You have taken a private situation and made it something ugly. Private. There was that word again. The favorite shelter of people who do wrong indoors and resent daylight. I let her finish. Every last sentence. I let her hear herself reducing blood loss to temperament and fraud to marital strain. I let her stand on my porch and build her own little tower of excuses until there was nothing left for her to add without repeating herself. Then I asked very calmly, "Are you done?" The question landed harder than a shouted insult ever could have. She blinked at me. Just once. A tiny interruption in the smoothness she had been trying so hard to maintain. For the first time since she arrived, the composure in her face slipped and showed me what sat under it. Not guilt, fear, not fear of me exactly, fear of irrelevance. Fear of discovering that all her practiced language had arrived at a door that no longer recognized her authority. There was a pause between us. The neighborhood behind her was quiet. Somewhere down the block, a lawn service had started up. A dog barked once, then stopped. Ordinary life continued with no awareness that Cora Simmons was standing on my porch, trying and failing to pull the world back toward herself. I looked at her and gave her the only response she had earned. "Get off my porch." Nothing about my voice rose. That was not necessary. The sentence carried itself. When her mouth parted as if she expected one more chance to explain, one more opening, one more little negotiation she could wring out of decency, I gave her none. I closed the door before she could recover enough to reshape the scene. No slam, no theatrics. Just the clean, final sound of wood meeting frame. I stood there for 1 second with my hand still on the knob, then turned and walked back to the kitchen. My coffee was still warm. My papers were still where I left them. The house did not feel shaken. It felt confirmed. Through the front window, I saw Cora remain on the porch a moment too long, shoulders rigid, handbag still clutched in both hands. Then she walked to her car with nothing left to carry but herself. Paper lasts longer than charm. By the time Gerald Hines sent over his finalized report, and this situation had moved past personality entirely. Not Jalen, not Cora, not even the soft little fog they had both tried to wrap around the facts. That part had burned off weeks earlier, during the slow, unglamorous back and forth of requests, verifications, follow-ups, and the kind of waiting that tests whether truth can hold its shape under pressure. It had. Sandra printed the report instead of reading it to me over the phone, which told me everything I needed to know before I even sat down in her office. 40 pages, clean tabs, no dramatic language, just numbers, dates, transfers, authorizations, account paths, and the kind of order that makes bad people look smaller than they imagine themselves to be. Gerald was already there when I arrived, seated at the conference end of Sandra's desk, with his glasses low on his nose and one hand resting on the report like he had delivered a weather pattern instead of a controlled demolition. He walked us through it page by page. The $31,000 loan was confirmed in full. Not a misunderstanding, not a marital blur, not a temporary shared decision that later went sour. The digital authorization traced back to Jalen's device usage. Not just once, repeated access patterns, consistent login behavior, enough to remove coincidence from the conversation entirely. The money moved first into the account Sandra had already flagged, then outward in a sequence that left very little room for imagination. Lease payments, personal withdrawals, structured movement, not impulse, and the property deposit in Concord, now fully linked through timing, transfer pattern, and account ownership. Gerald slid one page forward with a fingertip. "This is the important overlap," he said. The dates aligned. The loan activity, the device access, the transfer movement, and Lene's worsening physical condition all sat inside the same narrow stretch of time. That mattered, not because one harm excused the other, but because together they exposed a pattern. while she was isolated, unwell, and increasingly trained to doubt her own judgment, he was moving money through her name and into his future. Sandra watched me absorb that without interrupting. The room felt very still in the way rooms do when the truth becomes too organized to argue with. Nobody had to tell me what kind of pressure that created. I could see it in the structure itself. And the video from my living room, the hospital timeline, the incident report, Cora's admission that Lene had been in pain since the day before, the journal, the device trail, the property, all of it now touching. Nothing was floating anymore. "This is enough," Sandra said, not triumphantly, professionally. I looked at the report again. Page numbers, account endings, signature records. There was something almost insulting about how ordinary fraud looked once it was laid flat. No mastermind, no brilliance, just greed with access and the mistaken belief that a woman's trust was the same thing as permission. The next pressure point didn't come from noise. It came from where the paperwork landed. Jalen's employer did not receive some dramatic accusation. They received what employers tend to fear most: documentation tied to conduct, money, and credibility, delivered through counsel in a format that did not invite interpretation. He worked in real estate. Trust was part of the sale, whether people said so out loud or not. A man in the middle of separation proceedings involving misused funds and false financial positioning was no longer a quiet personal matter once documentation began attaching his name to it. Sandra's phone buzzed midway through the meeting. She checked the screen, then said, "Interesting." I waited. "His office has retained counsel," she said, "and they've requested copies of certain filings." "Trying to get ahead of it," I said. She nodded once. "That's usually what this means." Not stop it, not deny it. Get ahead of it. There was a difference. Pressure. Once documented does not move quickly. It tightens, gradually, consistently, until the person holding the wrong end of it understands that time is no longer working in their favor. When Gerald left, Sandra stayed seated with the report open between us. She tapped one page lightly, then closed the file. "In 20 years," she said, "I have seen women come in here with much less and spend much longer fighting to be believed." I held her gaze. She gave the smallest nod. "This resolves in your favor." Not today, not instantly, but inevitably. I thought I would feel satisfaction hearing that. Instead, I felt something quieter. Not relief exactly. Not yet. More like the deep settling that comes when a floor you've been testing with one foot finally holds your full weight. I picked up the report, squared the pages, and slid them back into the folder. Paper had outlived performance again. It was never about the drink. It was about what the drink revealed. By the time the papers were signed, nobody was pretending otherwise. Not Jalen. Not his attorney. Not Cora. Not even the thin little circle of relatives who had tried for a few noisy weeks to turn documented harm into family misunderstanding. That part had burned itself out slowly. Calls, filings, responses, delays that weren't really delays, just pressure finding its shape. There had been offers that didn't hold, positions that shifted, small attempts to soften language that could not be softened without breaking the truth underneath it. Sandra handled all of it without urgency and without hesitation, the way you do when time is already working in your favor. When the truth had outlasted all of them, because the truth had records, dates, signatures, transfers, police notes, medical timelines, and one video that no one could watch without seeing exactly where everybody had been when it mattered. Sandra called me just after lunch on a Thursday. "It's done," she said. No long build-up, no performance. She knew better than that. The financial settlement was final, not immediate, structured. Repayment terms documented and enforceable, scheduled over time in a way that did not rely on apology or conscience. The money tied to Lene's name and moved through Jalen's hands would come back the only way things like that ever truly come back? Through obligation. His property claim had collapsed under tracing. What he thought he had secured quietly could not survive visibility. The conquered deposit, or once connected, stopped being an asset and became evidence. The separation was finalized with the financial findings attached in a way that would follow him longer than whatever version of the story he tried to tell next. Reputation, once documented, does not reset cleanly. I thanked her and ended the call. Then I stood in my kitchen with the phone still in my hand and let the quiet settle over me. Not relief, not yet. Something steadier than that. Broderick was at work that afternoon, but Lene was upstairs folding laundry, moving through the house with that careful steadiness she had grown into over the past weeks. Not fragile anymore, not fully healed either. Something better than both. Honest. I walked to the bottom of the stairs and called her name once. She looked down at me from the landing. "It's finished," I said. And she did not ask me which part, she knew. For a second, she just stood there with one of my pillowcases in her hands. Then she came down the stairs slowly, not because her body still hurt, but because big news deserves the dignity of being walked toward. When she reached the last step, she looked at me the way people do when they have braced for impact so long they no longer know what to do with gentle outcomes. Really? Yes. That was all it took. She sat down at the kitchen table and covered her face with both hands, not crying hard, not collapsing, just sitting with the weight of something finally ending where it should have ended. I pulled out the chair beside her and stayed there until she lowered her hands again. That evening, we ate at home. That mattered to me more than any restaurant would have. And I wanted the walls to witness the difference. I wanted the room that had once held fear to hold something else and know itself by a new memory. Broderick cooked salmon and roasted potatoes. Lene made a salad and argued mildly with him over how much lemon belonged in the dressing. I set the table with the good plates because ordinary peace deserves ceremony too. When I opened a bottle, it was wine, not champagne. I poured 3 glasses and set them down carefully. Lene's eyes caught on the stem for half a second. I saw the memory move across her face and then move on. She picked up the glass anyway. We did not make a speech. We ate. We passed bread. Broderick told a story about a subcontractor who had once tried to invoice the government for a generator he never delivered. And for the first time in longer than I could cleanly measure, Lene laughed from somewhere real. Not polite laughter, not survival laughter, the kind that leaves the body loose afterward. I leaned back in my chair and watched her. Not because everything was fixed. Some things do not return just because papers are signed. Trust does not regrow on command. Bodies remember fear after courts stop naming it. Money can be repaid more easily than ease can. But the room was safe. That was not a small thing. At the end of dinner, Broderick gathered the plates. Lene carried the glasses to the sink, and I stood for a moment at the head of the table looking at the bottle between us, half empty now under the warm kitchen light. The first time I came home, I found champagne beside neglect. This time there was wine beside peace, and that cost them everything they thought they could keep. 6 months later, healing looked less dramatic than people promised, and more useful than they ever described. Lene had her own apartment now, 2nd floor, good light in the mornings, a narrow balcony that overlooked a row of crepe myrtles, and a parking lot that never quite looked beautiful, but looked solid enough to trust. She had furnished it slowly, which I respected. No desperate rush to prove a new life all at once. A sofa she chose herself, 2 lamps that did not match but somehow belonged together, a blue kettle on the stove, books stacked on the floor until she decided where she wanted the shelf to go. It was not a perfect space. It was better than that. It was hers. She still saw her therapist every week, and she still had nights that landed wrong and mornings that took longer than they used to. but she no longer apologized for needing time. She no longer checked her phone as if it might accuse her. She no longer shrank when silence entered a room. Those were not small changes. Those were foundations. The repayment order had started quietly 2 months earlier, structured, automatic, the kind of correction that does not ask for acknowledgement to keep moving. Sandra had sent over the confirmation without ceremony. I read it once, filed it, and moved on. That mattered more than anything loud ever could have. Broderick helped her move the last of the boxes in one bright Saturday stretch that smelled like cardboard, dust, and fresh coffee. He carried more than he should have and complained less than he had earned the right to. When I unpacked kitchen things while Lene decided where she wanted everything, changing her mind twice about the mugs and once about the silverware drawer. By the time we were down to the final box, the place had begun to look lived in instead of temporary. Broderick set that last box in the corner of the living room and looked around once, hands on his hips. "Your mama did the same thing at your age," he said. "Started with very little and made it hold." Lene laughed, then unexpectedly covered her eyes with one hand. He pretended not to notice the tears gathering there. That was one of the kindest things about him. He knew when to witness directly and when to give dignity room to breathe. He turned toward the hallway and asked, with exaggerated seriousness, where she wanted the bookshelf, and as if shelving decisions were the most urgent issue in North Carolina. She pointed, still half laughing. "By the wall." "Good choice," he said. I watched her then and understood something I had not let myself fully name before. Independence had not returned her to who she was before Jalen and Cora. It had introduced her to the version of herself built after them. That woman was quieter than the girl who had first brought him home, but she was also clearer, more deliberate, less willing to confuse tolerance with love. At work, people had begun asking me the retirement question in a tone that suggested possibility instead of surrender. I no longer dismissed it the second it was mentioned. I had spent so many years building and protecting and pushing that I had confused usefulness with permanence. And now I found myself listening differently when my supervisor mentioned transition timelines and consulting options. Not because I was ready to leave everything, because I was finally willing to imagine a life that was not always braced. That evening, after we left Lene's apartment, Broderick drove, and I watched the city slide by in the window glass. Charlotte, in early evening, has a way of looking half-finished and complete at the same time. Construction cranes in one direction, church steeples in another, light catching office towers, traffic thickening then breaking, a city that understood reinvention without announcing it as virtue. 2 days later, I came home from a short work trip to Raleigh. Nothing dramatic. One regional meeting, a hotel bed too firm for my liking. It's a 2-hour delay on the drive back because of road work outside Durham. By the time I pulled into the driveway, dusk had settled over the yard in a soft blue-gray wash. I got out, lifted my carry-on from the back seat, and walked up the front path with the kind of tiredness that no longer frightened me. When I opened the front door, the house met me exactly as it should have. Clean, quiet, whole. No wrongness in the air. No carelessness waiting in the sink. No cold little signs that somebody else had mistaken my labor for atmosphere. Just the familiar hum of home and the low sound of movement from deeper inside. Broderick was there somewhere, unhurried, present, giving the place its second heartbeat. I set my bag down by the door and stood still for a moment in the entryway. 6 months earlier, and I had walked into this same house and found champagne sitting comfortably beside neglect. Now there was nothing in this house that did not belong, nothing pretending to be care, nothing waiting to be excused, just quiet that meant what it said. Then I smiled. I was home.